in Southern Africa. Good afternoon to everybody who's in Southern Africa or in Europe, and good morning if there's anybody in America. This is the third, I think, webinar in our series of webinars on really democracy in Africa, organized by Matthias Kunke and Sishuwa Sishuwa for the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy in Africa here at University of Cape Town. I'm Jeremy Seekings. I'm the acting director of the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy in Africa. We've got a great lineup of speakers this afternoon, none of whom really need introduction, I'm sure. They're all either famous for before the election, and if they weren't famous before the election, they're certainly famous now. So we want to get stuck right in. I'm going to ask the speakers to try and keep to as close as possible to 10 minutes as they can, which will leave lots of time for discussion and questions afterwards. I'll get a bit agitated if they go beyond, much beyond that, and certainly if they go beyond 15 minutes. So the order of speakers will be, first of all, Nic Cheeseman, and provisionally then we'll go to Nicole Beardsworth, and we'll go to Linda Kasonde, and we'll end up with Sishuwa, if Sishuwa is here. Everyone who knows Sishuwa is habitually late, so I hope he'll be. Hey, Sishuwa, hello. Greetings.
I can see the best thing about me live.
Okay, so we're going to start off with Nic Cheeseman. As everybody probably knows, he's Professor of Democracy at the University of Birmingham, writes extensively about democracy in Africa, particularly in Kenya and in Zambia. He's an energetic on Twitter under his it doesn't count as a pseudonym, Fromage Home. And Nic, over to you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Jeremy. I hope everyone can hear me okay. First of all, just like to say it's a real honor to be on this call with people like Linda, Kasonde and Sishuwa, who are really the heroes of this moment. And I hope we get a moment today to talk about what they've done and to discuss some of the work they've done. And I'm certainly not in that category, but I'm very delighted and honored to be on a call with those figures. The second thing to say is, I've been a part of a great research team doing research on this election. So with others like Nicole, but also a couple of people who aren't here, Maya Hinfela and Brian Carper, and I'd just like to pay tribute to that brilliant research team. When we got the announcement through that President Lungu had indeed conceded, I think it's fair to say that all of us were crying like a baby. It was a really great emotional moment and an honor to be in Zambia when it happened. And I'd like to leap off from that, because the reason why we were so emotional is because this wasn't in the bag. This was not straightforward. And I think one of the things we really need to be careful about now is that we don't sort of tell history backwards. Well, the election happened, we got a transfer of power, therefore the election must have been okay and Lungu must have been a good guy. And even today, if you look on Twitter, you can see that kind of take. Well, Zambia did it again. It must have always been going this way. Don't we always see good things happening in Zambia? And well done, President Lungu, for being a Democrat. And in reality, I think, and I think you'll hear this from each of the speakers today, it was a very different situation to that. It really was touch and go until quite late on. It was very unclear whether or not President Lungu was going to accept defeat. Even on the night when the Electoral Commission announced that Hichilema had won, Lungu did not concede, and we had to wait until the next day. And there was a very dangerous period overnight in the day before when President Lungu himself actually said the election was not free and fair and suggested that it should be cancelled. So I think we must resist a kind of revisionist history of this election that suggests it was good quality and a foregone conclusion, and we should actually start from the beginning. And only when we do so do we see how important the work of people like Linda and Sishuwa was in keeping the kind of flame of democracy alive in Zambia in a very dark period. And also, do we understand actually that this could have gone a very different way? So in my sort of opening remarks, my job is, I think, to set the scene and perhaps put this in a slightly comparative context, and everybody else can drill down into the aspect of the election that they'd like to. Now, from my point of view, I study African elections, and as many of you will know, the vast majority of these are won by the government. And so what I would like to start talking about is, what are the things that we tend to know allow opposition parties to win elections in Africa, and how many of those were actually present in Zambia? And I think it's when we think through that we actually start to see what a remarkable outcome we have in this election. So the first of those key factors, the first of the 5 factors that we tend to see when we see transfers of power are key democratic institutions, higher quality democracy. The second is, the domestic civilianization of the security forces and a lack of politicization. The third is that the ruling president does not stand. The fourth is that the economy is very bad. And the fifth is that we have a unified opposition. And we tend to say that when we get all 5 of those, the chances of an opposition victory are pretty good. When you have only 1 or 2, it's not so good. So let me run through those things for you in Zambia to prepare you for the comments that will come. When it comes to democratic institutions and the quality of democracy, it's quite common in the media to say we all know that Zambia is one of Africa's more open countries, it's one of Africa's more democratic countries, and therefore perhaps you would expect to transfer power. But it's critical to understand that over the last 5 or 6 years, President Lungu has hollowed out some of Zambia's key democratic institutions. We have a new constitutional court that was created under the Lungu presidency with all of the justices appointed by Lungu himself. So there was a lot of controversy and worry around the election that we would see, for example, an election petition of the opposition simply dismissed by the court, or a petition by the president himself, potentially successful. And we saw problems in other key institutions going into the elections as well. We saw, for example, the appointment of individuals close to the president or from his homeland areas in terms of the ruling party support base, appointed to key positions in the military, key positions within the cabinet, key positions within the police, and so on. So there was a worry about a politicization of key institutions, but also a process of ethnic discrimination within those institutions that undermined the credibility of many of them in the eyes of civil society groups and opposition supporters, and really created that atmosphere of concern going into the elections that actually those institutions have been weakened beyond repair. Interestingly, it turns out that key institutions like the Electoral Commission stood up to be counted, but we were not necessarily taking that for granted as we went into the election, because the Electoral Commission itself made a number of bizarre decisions that undermined the electoral process. For example, after the courts ruled that it was legal and necessary for the Electoral Commission to allocate a minimum amount of time for opposition parties on the media, one of the things we saw was the Electoral Commission allocating just 30 seconds a day for the opposition to be able to be on the media. So in that case, we actually see the Electoral Commission making a decision that seemed clearly to be biased. And therefore, we had significant concerns about what the Electoral Commission would do if it was put under great pressure on the day. Second, moving on to the security forces, we also had a concern there. Zambia's army has historically been apolitical and not been deployed. There have been some coup attempts that have been failed, but it hasn't been deployed on the streets around elections. It hasn't done the role, for example, that the army and security forces have done in Uganda for President Museveni. But in 2018, as part of that pattern of appointments that I was talking about, President Lungu removed the army commander and replaced him with somebody who was seen to be close to Lungu and from the Patriotic Front support base. So again, raising concern that the military might not be as neutral in this election as they were in the past. And that concern was exacerbated just days before the election when we saw the military deployed in Lusaka, and not just in Lusaka, it's important to say in many parts of the country, on the basis of the government's claim that this was necessary to maintain order and peace. But for many people, there was a serious concern that that was designed to intimidate opposition voters, and that military deployment was supposed to be a way of making sure that post-election protests could be easily contained. At the same time, so if we look at those first 2 institutions, democratic, two factors, democratic institutions that allow for more free and fair contest, security forces that are completely civilianized and not politicized in any way, there were really serious concerns going into this election that those did not point in the right direction. When it comes to a sitting president, as some of you will know from my other research, I've shown that when the president stands himself, he wins 88, or she wins 88% of all elections. That's 88% of all elections in Africa. But when the president stands down, there's a much bigger chance for the opposition to win. Most of the time, that's because the ruling party splits over the process of replacing the president, and therefore you get a fragmentation of the ruling party that creates a window of opportunity that the opposition could take advantage of. So in the Zambian case, we don't see that. President Lungu changed the constitution and put pressure on the constitutional court to be able to run for a 3rd term. So instead of having a new president and that fragmentation of the ruling party ahead of the election, creating that window of opportunity for the opposition, we actually see a sitting president and a relatively unified ruling party. So the first 3 factors that we would normally look for in terms of suggesting that there's a good chance of an opposition victory were not actually present in Zambia. And I think that's one reason why going into the election, many of us were concerned that this could be a process of a kind of election controlled and manipulated. There are a number of things that maybe I should just flag very quickly before I move on to the final couple of points that intensified that concern. One was that President Lungu had shown a clear authoritarian bent. Not only had he imprisoned Hakainde Hichilema, the opposition leader, on charges of treason, but he also accused other people, such as, or his government had accused other people, such as Sishuwa here on the call, of treason as a way of trying to silence dissent. So this was increasingly seen as a repressive regime that would use things like treason accusations as a way of silencing its critics. We also saw over the last few years the closure of the Post newspaper and the closure of Prime TV, two independent sources of media, leaving Zambians more reliant on state media, which is completely dominated by the government. Remember what I said earlier about the ECZ only allowing opposition parties 30 seconds a day on those state broadcasters. So there were many sort of factors here in the background that suggested that we were moving towards a really problematic and difficult elections that might be manipulated by the ruling party. And if you look at a lot of the analysis before the elections, most people were saying that the opposition had a good chance of winning if the election was free and fair, but they were not sure that the election was going to be free and fair. So let me get to those final 2 points. I've suggested that, the democratic institutions, the security forces, and the fact that the president was an incumbent were not necessarily in favor of a free and fair process, or at least we didn't know that at the start of the election. What then happens? I think the economic decline is absolutely critical here. One of the things that everybody has talked about in this election is how significant the economy has been. As everyone I think will know, Zambia's had very difficult economic conditions recently. We've seen a debt default, we've seen the decline in the kwacha, but we've also seen inflation undermine the value of wages, and we've seen people's standard of living fall considerably. And the research that's come out, including from the government's own data sets, suggests that, for example, the price of chicken has increased by about 75% over the last 12 months. The price of other key goods such as cooking oil has gone up about 50% over the last 12 months. So people are struggling to be able to actually eat the way that they would have done a few years ago. And indeed, the government's own figures suggest that something like 40% of people in Zambia ahead of this election were either reducing portion sizes, or they were going from 3 meals a day to 2 meals a day, or 2 meals a day to 1 meal a day. So we have significant hardship and significant economic concern. And more particularly, I think, and this is really important, concern that people were blaming generally on the government and on the president, and a concern that was not simply about the past being bad, but about the future. So in many of the surveys, it's not just that Zambians felt the last 12 months were bad economically, they did not have confidence that this government could turn it around. And I think that groundswell of economic frustration and recognition that under this government, Zambians had lost both their development and their political and civil rights, that combination then created this groundswell that we saw. And we saw this very early on voting day, when there were large crowds, long queues, much longer than you might normally expect, outside polling stations. And for example, in Lusaka, even though it was a fairly authoritarian context, people I talked to in the queues were very quick to say, we are here to vote for change. You don't see this many people voting early if they don't want change. So I think that economic factor was absolutely critical and enabled the opposition to make significant inroads, not just in terms of boosting their vote in their own heartlands. If you look at the election results, Hakainde Hichilema, the opposition leader, gained between 5 and 20% of a swing in the vast majority of constituencies in the entire country. And that then leads me to the final point, and then I'll rest and bring everybody else in, which is that, the fifth point that you usually look for in terms of a transfer of power is a united opposition. And Zambia did have that this time around. In previous elections, we've sometimes seen UPND be one of 2 or 3 significant opposition parties going against the government. In this one, the minor candidates, the third-party candidates, were relatively insignificant. They didn't get above 1% of the vote. It was a 2-horse race with 2 main candidates, and the opposition really coalesced around Hichilema and his campaign. And that enabled his campaign to break out from its traditional heartlands, as it has been from 2015 and 16 onwards, breaking into urban areas, broadening its support base, and getting more support across the country. And as I say, one of the things I think we shouldn't lose sight of is that there was a significant trend towards Hichilema from Lungu in almost all parts of the country. And that, I think, leads us to a final point, which is really important, which is that people in Zambia have proved time and time again that they are willing to vote across ethnic and regional lines for change, uniting behind a leader who is not from their own community in order to secure change. We saw that in 1991, when an overwhelming majority of people lined up behind Chiluba to vote out UNIP and Kaunda. We saw that in 2011, when again, a strong majority of people lined up behind Michael Sata to vote out Rupaya Banda and MMD. And we saw that this time around, with people coming together from different areas. I think that the two things perhaps to flag just at the very end then is, where does that leave us? Well, I suggested we had 2 or 3 factors that were perhaps not in favor of a transfer of power and a couple of factors that very much were. I think for me, one of the things that's really important in this election, and perhaps a defining feature, is the margin of victory. Hichilema did not just defeat Lungu, he destroyed Lungu. He beat Lungu by a margin of victory that no Zambian president has ever won in terms of absolute numbers, around 1 million votes. That's simply too big to rig. It's simply too big to claim that the election was manipulated against you, which Lungu tried to do. Let's not forget that he issued a statement that said the election was not free and not fair. He tried to manipulate that narrative. He tried to push that story. But I think the margin of victory was too great. And perhaps that margin of victory was one of the things that emboldened the Electoral Commission to be strong enough to release the results when the president clearly didn't want them to. It was perhaps that margin of victory that encouraged the military to be so neutral on the streets and to maintain their duty so well. And that margin of victory ultimately that enabled the people around Lungu and of course Rupaya Banda and the others who were involved in the negotiations to make him realize that now was a time he had to step down. It was not possible to sustain this. So again, I think the 2 key points that I would like to say are, I think we shouldn't forget how touch and go this was. This could have been a very different outcome if it wasn't for people like Linda and Sishuwa keeping the fight and maintaining civil society, and if it wasn't for that margin of victory, which really meant that there was nowhere for Lungu to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nick. Perfect. So we're going to go straight on. We've had a shuffling of the order. Sishuwa, I'm hoping you can come up next. Sishuwa Sishuwa is a historian. He did his PhD in Oxford with Nick, and he's a lecturer at University of Zambia, and he's a postdoc at University of Cape Town, and he's a very prominent public intellectual. Sishuwa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. I think you have set the stage, and what I'll try to do is to speak to some of the points that Nick has made by essentially answering one question. Why did Hichilema win, rather than why did Lungu lose? And I'll speak very briefly about 5 key points, which I think build on what Nick has just said. The first point is that Hichilema learned from electoral failure to build a multi-ethnic coalition. One of the consistent criticism that Hichilema has received from his opponents has been that he has been leading a regional party that draws much of his support from southern province, where he comes from, populated by Tonga speakers, Western province and Northwestern province. He has also drawn support from Central province. But this criticism has come despite the fact that if you look at the 2016 and 2015 elections, he actually drew significant support from the urban presses of Lusaka, as well as Copperbelt, even though Lungu and the PF ultimately won those provinces. So what he does in responding to electoral failure is really to address that in both in the way of the leadership within the party, the National Management Committee of the UPND, but also in relation to how he builds alliances with ethnic big men and women from outside his traditional support base. So going to this election, for example, his running mate was Mutare Narumango, who was a Bemba speaker from the Northern Province, a widely accepted candidate. He didn't have any baggage, for example, compared to Edgar Lungu's running mate in Kanluo, who was very much opposed by key sectors of the Zambian society, including ministries which Pesh has headed. But Hichilema also managed to make the UPND to go back to the original UPND of Anderson Mazoka in the 2021, for example, which was the multi-ethnic party that drew support from across the country because it had these ethnic big men and women within its leadership positions. The party did not recover from the succession wrangle that it suffered after Mazoka's death in 2006, it took a long period before it reverted to that 2001 UPND, which was the multi-ethnic coalition. And he brought together, people like Kelvin Waliafube, Felix Mutati, and was able to ward off that persistent criticism that he's a leader who is not capable of mobilizing support or drawing support from other major ethnic groups. And going into this election, for example, if you looked at the National Management Committee of the UPND, what you saw was a party that was representative of Zambia's ethnic diversity. And voters, I think, increasingly began to position him or to compare him to Lungu, who was very much a divisive leader, and Zambians, going by the result of this election, voters suggest that they're actually very positive, the kind of messages that embody unity. The death of Kaunda, I think, highlighted the importance of national ethnic diversity and national unity. And Hichilema, I think, tapped into that in terms of how he positioned himself compared to Lungu as the heir to Kaunda. So he learned from electoral failure to build that multi-ethnic coalition that the UPND has become today. And I would say that is the first point that we could point at as very crucial. He won support in all of Zambia's 10 provinces. If you look at the figures, it's only, I think, in Ruapula where the UPND did not get a parliamentary seat, but now they have representation at parliamentary level in all the provinces, and that really speaks to the appeal that the UPND has been able to make across the ethnic divide. The second point, I think, is that it's the economy, and Nic mentioned this point very well. Going into the election, if you listen to the campaigns of both candidates, Lungu did not have a key message on the economy. He highlighted his considerable achievements in infrastructure, largely because there was nothing else to say. Hichilema was more successful in presenting himself as better placed to fixing Zambia's economic problems, including the debt crisis, through better fiscal management. And he also communicated a sense of being on top of things and appeared to be ahead when talking about what needs to be done. Lungu's campaign strategy, as I said, in contrast, almost exclusively emphasized infrastructure development. And the president did not address any of the major economic issues at all, such as how he's going to solve the high levels of unemployment, especially among the youths who were crucial constituents in this election that really voted for change. And the debt crisis, which largely happened under the PF and was likely to weigh down whichever government won power. Given his economic background and the failures of the incumbents to present an alternative economic program, Hichilema took advantage of the failure of the incumbent to really position himself as better placed to respond to the economic needs and aspirations of the voters. The third point, I think, is that he was pitted against a deeply unpopular incumbent who showed no leadership on key issues, but also against poorly organized new and smaller opposition parties. Zambia moved to being a two-party system in effect in 2016. Until then, you had the MMD, the ruling party from 1991 until 2011 when it lost power. You had the UPND, and then you had the PF. Starting 2016, the MMD collapsed or disintegrates. Some faction of the MMD get into the PF, other factions get into the UPND. The remnant of that remain with Nevas Mumba, who has not been able to mobilize the MMD or to resurrect the MMD because he has lacked a coherent message that he can use to mobilize voters beyond the idea of having brought democracy to Zambia. And the ruling parties in Zambia have failed really to win the support of voters after losing power, as we saw in UNIP in 1991. And the MMD suffered that fate going into the 2016 election. The consequence of that election was that the country became a two-party system, UPND and Patriotic Front. So if the ruling party was seen by voters having found, the alternative was basically the UPND or other parties. Even though we had 16 parties or candidates on the ballot, many of these parties were either smaller parties without any clear power base at all, or they were formed very late to actually be able to stamp themselves on the national scene Hari Kalava, who came third, for example, resigned from the PF only in 2018 and did not have time to mobilize until after, I think, a year or so when his court cases were cleared after the government attempted to deregister his party. If he had sufficient time, I think going forward, he could have actually taken maybe significant votes away from both parties. But then he also had Fred Member Socialist Party. Again, this is a party that was formed, I think, in March 2018, and did not have sufficient time really to establish themselves as household names across the country. The combination of these factors, fact that you had smaller parties pitted against two dominant parties, including one which was extremely unpopular in the eyes of voters, meant that voters were increasingly looking at Hichilema as the best candidate to basically remove Lungu if they were unsatisfied with the incumbent. So it wasn't much of a rejection of the other candidate as it was a referendum against Edgar Lungu and the Patriotic Front. And Hichilema, having been on the political scene since 2006, having been responding to electoral failure in a way that he enhanced his position, benefited from both the failures of the incumbent to respond to the concerns of voters, but also from his own ability to position himself as a better place to deal with the different challenges that Zambia is facing, including the erosion of democracy, as well as the state of the economy. The next point, I think, is about there was some kind of elite pact, power shifts in Zambia when there's some kind of elite understanding that there is need for change, and then the elites, whether it's in civil society, whether it's in churches, whether it's security services, for example, come to some kind of informal understanding that they have to support the change, political change, for example. We saw this in 2011, and we saw this even in 1991, when members of civil society grouped around the MMD and threw the weight of their support behind the opposition party, which ultimately defeated Kaunda. In 2011, civil society was very crucial to the PF's victory, built around the need for constitutional reform. In this election, what we saw was, members of the clergy, for example, the Catholic Church, members of civil society, they did not expressly endorse Hichilema, the person that they wanted Zambians to vote for. But if you listened to their messages, there appeared to be some kind of understanding that they were in effect encouraging voters to vote against Lungu, and voters, of course, would make sense of who to support if change was necessary. And even the media, if you look at the state of the media outside the public media, which governed, which covered the Patriotic Front and members of the government, the private media, except the Daily Nation, led by news diggers and the Mass, for example, which had a sway on public opinion, really presented Hichilema in a very positive way. And what you see there is some kind of elite pact between members of civil society, the media, churches, security services, to not frustrate change. Security services is crucial here because part of my research has shown that at crucial junctures when Lungu attempted to frustrate Hichilema's campaign, for example, even within the military, for example, and the security services, there was a pushback against some of the measures that Lungu was trying to do, including through electoral exclusion, most notably demonstrated in early 2020 when a spate of suspicious incidents in urban areas, which saw people, suffering loss of consciousness due to some suspicious chemicals which were sprayed at them unexplained, and people were wondering what's going on. Sources within the military suggest, for example, that was a part of the ruling authorities' ploy to implicate Hichilema and perhaps have him arrested and have him excluded from the electoral contest. There was a pushback from the lower rank of the military against that move, and it collapsed largely because of that. And we see this even in the case of Chiluba's third term bid in 2001, when members of the military, for example, pushed back against the attempts of Chiluba to seek a third term bid. But that is a result of what happens when there is elite understanding that the incumbent, for example, has become a danger, including to the country's state of democracy. human rights violations were rampant under Lungu. The erosion of democracy was something that Zambia had never witnessed before. And even when voters were going to vote, for example, I met people on the queues who had not decided who to vote for, who said, I didn't imagine, for example, that I would be in a Zambia where the internet is blocked. Having shut down the traditional media before the election, the Lungu government proceeded to shut down social media on the day of the elections. There are people who are actually infuriated by that decision and ultimately felt that it was important to save the country's as democracy. But Lungu also didn't show leadership. For example, crucial national issues, the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, he was nowhere to be seen. And Zambians wanted a president who could show leadership on some of these key issues. Hichilema seized some of these opportunities to present himself as the leader that Zambia needed in that moment. And the final point I wish to draw attention to, I think, is this idea that the PF won 2011 on a campaign strategy of don't whoever, which means that, if you are competing against an opponent who has much resources to spend yours, how do you deal with them? You tell voters to receive the gifts that the opponent dishes out to them, but to vote for you in the ballot, of course, there's no way of simply finding out who you voted for. If that strategy was successful in bringing the PF to power, I would actually say that it was successful in their defeat, because the PF, ahead of this election, for example, resorted to some kind of populist measure, whether it's in relation to civil servants, whether in relation to youth empowerment programs, and a couple of other issues, perhaps affecting minors. People, took these policies and gifts. But ultimately, if you look at the scale of Lungu's defeat, it suggests that the Don't Kubeba strategy was actually more effective, perhaps this time, than it was in 2016, going by the figures that we see in relation to the results. I should conclude, of course, very briefly by saying that it was difficult to see the victory of Hichilema in terms of the scale of it, because one, we had a new voter register whose credibility we did not know. So political analysts and even researchers found it difficult to make correct predictions about the elections going into this going into this contest. But the panic that we saw from the ruling party, represented by the bogus opinion polls that were organized, suggested that even they themselves actually lacked confidence in relation to their capacity to manipulate the results in case voter turnout was important, was low. That's another issue. Voter turnout was higher in this election than it has been in previous elections. And whenever you have this kind of turnout, for example, it is very unlikely that the incumbent can survive, let alone manipulate the results. And even though we had weak institutions, as Nic mentioned, going to this election, the police, the Electoral Commission of Zambia, were fairly partisan in the way they conducted their activities. The voters, in terms of turnout and the expression of their will for political change, was such that even the political elites, rather the elites in this key institution, could do very little to reverse the will of the people. And that's why we saw Lungu ultimately conceding defeat, because it became very clear that the rejection of his party and of himself was total. I'll end here for now. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much indeed. Third up, we have Linda Kasonde. Everybody probably knows who Linda is. She's a lawyer. In fact, she's got a law degree from the University of Cape Town. She's a former president of the Law Association of Zambia, and of course, she's particularly well known now as the founder of the Chapter 1 Foundation and as an absolute pillar and hero of civil society in Zambia. Linda, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, especially to speak at one of my alma mater. So I'm going to speak today about the human rights and rule of law situation in Zambia, the environment pre-election, and speak to what I think should improve going forward. So I'm going to turn off my camera now because my connection is a bit unstable, but I hope I'll still be able to come across clearly. So just give me a second. So Zambia has become sort of less free and over the last 10 years, and the narrative continued to be threatened by the rise of popularism and authoritarianism under the Patriotic Front government. Since 1964, an extensive amount of power has remained vested in the Republican president, and attempts at constitutional reform over the decades since independence have actually failed to address this problem adequately. Subsequently, negative repercussions for constitutionalism, separation of powers, and the rule of law in Zambia have emerged. And successive attempts at constitutional reform have failed to liberate the people of Zambia from restrictions on participation in the political space, and if anything, have increased political tension in the country. And since the demise of late President Levi Mwanawasa, who was widely perceived to observe the rule of law and champion the curbing of corruption, there had been a decline in the adherence to principles of constitutionalism and the rule of law in the country. And it had been demonstrated by, firstly, the state's unwillingness to adhere to court orders. You may recall, for example, that in August 2018, the Zimbabwean MDC politician Tendai Biti had sought asylum in Zambia and was granted a court order that allowed him to remain in Zambia, but he was nonetheless handed over to the Zimbabwean authorities and sent back to Zimbabwe in violation of that court order. There were also public threats against the independence of the judges and the legal profession. In November 2017, for example, President Lungu threatened judges not to follow the Kenyan example on the issue of whether or not he was eligible to stand in the 2021 elections. And as we saw, that judgment went in favor of President Lungu. He was ruled to be eligible to stand in the 2021 elections, despite the fact that the Constitution clearly limited his term to two terms. Also, we saw during that same month, the presidential press aide give an interview on the public broadcaster suggesting that any judgment against a member of parliament from the ruling party was not in the interest of justice, and further suggesting that there would be repercussions against any judge that ruled against the ruling member of parliament. But it's also worth noting that whilst the courts have been under attack from the executive, the courts as well have been heavy-handed in laying charges of criminal contempt against those that criticize them in the media. We saw that with the activist Gregory Chifire, who was given, I think it was a six-year term, I believe, as a contempt of court for having spoken out against the judges. And that of course was a very worrying sign, because judges should ordinarily only speak to their judgments and to the conduct of their cases. And the courts have also, in the period during which the Patriotic Front has been in government, been used as a battleground to fight political battles. We've also seen the courts being used to cleanse politicians of their corruption. We've seen sham trials, speedy trials, in which politicians are quickly tried and acquitted of various corrupt acts. We saw that with the Minister of Health, the previous Minister of Health. We saw that with various other political players during the Patriotic Front rule. And of course, we've also seen the weaponization of the law against citizens, particularly the Public Order Act and COVID regulations. Also the apparent partisanship of law enforcement agencies in securing peace and security with regards to public meetings of various political parties, civil society actors, the church. And there's generally been an increase in politically motivated violence by political parties in the country. the law enforcement agencies, were seen to be quite partisan in the manner in which they conducted their duties. And also we saw the arrest of civil society actors such as Laura Miti Pilato. This is in 2017 for protesting against the procurement of 42 fire trucks for $42 million, which obviously was an inflated price. We saw in December 2019 the arrest of popular musician Pilato, who was arrested on charges of unlawful assembly and conducting a workshop in Livingston. And when his colleagues Laura Miti and Bornwell tried to help him out, they too were arrested, and the trial lasted several months before they were discharged and acquitted. Also, we've also seen the use of archaic laws under the penal code to punish dissent in the country. For example, we've seen a rise in the number of criminal defamation cases, sedition, both those laws particularly, used particularly against opposition political parties. We've also seen an increase in the use of prolonged detention before trial of opposition political party actors. And also the courts have been unwilling, it seems, to rule against the government. I mean, almost all judgment, almost all cases against the court, against the state were decided in, most all cases in which the state was involved were decided in favor of the state, which was a very worrying trend. So in fact, when Chapter 1 Foundation managed to get the court order to have the internet shutdown reversed, it was actually a welcome and perhaps even a signal that in fact things were changing. The transition of power was in motion, because obviously it was a judgment against a public institution. We also saw the harassment of journalists and the closure of alternative media perceived to be anti-establishment, and a general lack of tolerance for divergent views. So in June 2016, we saw the government shut down the Post newspaper, ostensibly for tax-related issues. And in August 2016, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, an agency, a public agency run by officials appointed by the president, suspended the licenses of 3 private media houses just a few days before the UPND filed in a petition in the Constitutional Court contesting the outcome of the presidential election. We also saw the closure of the independent television station Prime TV in 2020, which of course was a violation of media freedoms, and also affected the free flow of information in the country, as many people relied on them for independent information. We also saw something very worrying, which was very reminiscent of the one-party state under the UNIP government, which was a blurring of the line between the ruling party and the government. And I think most starkly we saw that in this election, when we saw the Republican president issue a statement on official Republican president, on an official Republican president letterhead about calling on the ECZ to stop the counting of the votes. Now, obviously he was speaking as a candidate and not in his capacity as a Republican president. So that was also very worrying, and also seen as an abuse of his office to try and intimidate the ECZ, the Electoral Commission, into stopping the counting of the vote, ostensibly on the basis of allegations that his polling agents had not been allowed to operate freely at the polling stations in southern, western, and northwestern provinces. And also, just during the entire Patriotic Front tenure, we saw the rhetoric and statements of high-ranking government officials and senior officials within the ruling Patriotic Front that posed a threat to civil society, ordinary citizens, and human rights defenders who are labeled as being anti-government. There was a real sense of you're either for us or against us. And in August 2016, the newly created Constitutional Court handed down a judgment in favor of the Law Association of Zambia, in which LAS had sued all cabinet ministers in their individual capacities for failing to leave office after the dissolution of parliament. The court ruled that the ministers should pay back all the emoluments they had received back into the state coffers. And the ministers, the government pushed back by refusing to pay the money, but ultimately the pressure was such that the ministers succumbed and paid the money back. Also, in March 2017, the Law Association of Zambia was targeted by ruling party MPs who drafted a draft bill, which was published in the national press, threatening to introduce measures to dissolve the organization, which is the only professional legal organization in Zambia. And this was a response to LAS's vocal statements against infringements of constitutionalism and the rule of law. And in response to LAS's advocacy, groups of young activists from the Patriotic Front stormed the LAS offices and threatened not only myself as LAS president, but also the members of staff who were at the office at the time. And members of the association that were affiliated to the Patriotic Front called for an extraordinary general meeting to declare a vote of no confidence in the Council of the Law Association. Another very troubling trend that we experienced under the Patriotic Front rule was divide and rule. So under Article 3 of the Patriotic Front Party's constitution, it basically says that they should ensure that all public institutions, state-owned enterprises, and popular mass and similar organizations are led by persons who are members of the party and who are uncompromisingly committed to the achievements of the party. And we saw that so clearly, particularly with the Economic Association of Zambia. Its president, Rubinda Habazoka, was actively campaigning for the Patriotic Front in this last election. Independence of professional institutions was compromised. The church was infiltrated under slogans such as Christians for Lungu. We saw what Zimbabweans call gongos, and government NGOs used to deliver the government's narrative and also to undermine credible civil society organizations, which has caused a lot of tension in the country. We also saw the rise of legal authoritarianism.
Linda,
yes?
You need to start wrapping up, I think, please.
Okay. We also saw the rise of legal authoritarianism. Basically, the weaponization of the law to favor the government, such as the introduction of the Cybersecurity and Cyber Crimes Act, which aims to police the digital space, the abuse of the Public Order Act to police and restrict freedom of assembly, the attempted enactment of the Constitution Amendment Bill number 10 of 2019 to basically overhaul the Constitution to give the incumbents a stronghold on power. So basically, in terms of the way forward, what has been lacking so far has been the weakening of our institutions here in Zambia, such as the National Prosecution Authority, the Judiciary, the Anti-Corruption Commission. And as I always say, good institutions need good people. And that's something that we hope that the incoming government will deliver, putting in people on the basis of merit as opposed to party affiliation. We also think we need judicial reform. The judiciary has been packed with people who've come from the public service as opposed to independent actors, people who are affiliated to the ruling party in one way or the other. And also, we just need the rule of law to, I mean, there's just been a breakdown of the rule of law and order and in the country. We saw it with Patriotic Front cadres ruling the marketplaces and bus stops in our country. There's just, and the police couldn't do anything about it. And in fact, the police have been beaten up by political party cadres. So we just need a restoration of law and order in the country. And we hope that that will be delivered under this government.
Linda, thank you very, very much indeed. That was a really comprehensive overview of all of the onslaught on the rule of law under Lungu and the enormous amount of work that the new government's going to have to do. Our final speaker is Nicole Beardsworth, who is sitting in Lusaka Airport, and I hope is with us. Nicole, are you with us?
I am here, and I am sitting in KKIA.
Good. Nicole, just as by way of introduction, Nicole is now a lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and she's a media star now, and she tweets under the handle Nic CB. Nicole, over to you.
Fab. Thanks so much, Jeremy. So I think I apologize. I had to dash out at some point because I needed to get through immigration, etc. So I've missed some of the conversation. And I also realized that we're getting to time. So I'm going to keep it really brief so we can have a good discussion with lots of questions. Just to sort of wrap up some of the things that I think other people have touched on, but are really important to reiterate. You know, this was essentially like, hi. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Hi, good, and you?
Are you the one smoking?
No, I'm not smoking. No, I don't have a cigarette. Sorry about that. That was someone just checking whether or not I was smoking in the airport, which I am not. Okay, so just to reiterate, as I was saying, you know, this was an election, as I think Linda and Sishuwa and Nic have all pointed out, that had lots of concerns. This was not a free and fair election where the opposition won a landslide. This was an election where the opposition had their hands tied behind their backs, and they won anyway. Which I think is really remarkable. And it points to some of the things that we've been starting to think about. You know, when do institutions assert their independence? When is it possible for the ECZ to stand up to the president in the context of an extremely fraught and polarized electoral race? And so what we had seen before this election was extreme polarization within civil society, within the electorate. There was enormous rates of refusals in surveys for people to say who they were planning to vote for. So people seemed to be scared and intimidated and worried about the outcomes of the election. But nonetheless, what we saw was an overwhelming vote for the opposition. And I think it's important to note that in our understanding, and I've had this conversation with many, the trouble is that, oh, I'm about to be asked a question again. So it seems that the trouble is that, okay, they passed, sorry. Security in the airport is tight. So the problem with this election was not that it was free and fair, but that the result was so overwhelming in favor of the opposition. It was really a referendum, as I think some have said, on the previous government, that they had done so much to sort of lose the trust of voters that the result was overwhelming for the opposition. But it was also about the opposition having a very effective plan for how to manage an election that everyone believed was going to be very close. So they had agents, as I understand, 2 in every polling station, and there were 12,000 polling stations. That's 24,000 agents. There were also multiple civil society groups which had up to 4 agents or monitors per polling station. I was told by someone this morning that in the polling station that they were in, the polling officer wanted to refuse to give them a Gen 20, which is the results form. And so they stood up and they loudly said, you know, we are not leaving until you give us the Gen 20. And there were party members outside who were looking in through the windows and started saying, give us the Gen 20. And so it was this immense mobilization at the extremely local level to try to ensure that the vote was honest. But also, given the scale of the opposition support, it seems clear to me that that polling agents and the Electoral Commission took a more independent stance, because it was just, it was an overwhelming victory in favor of the opposition that no one really wanted to stand in the way of. So even though we had all of these compromised institutions and we saw a very unfair playing field, it was the scale of the victory that was so unprecedented as to give these institutions space to breathe. And so thinking of where we go from here, you know, I think, as Linda has said, there's a hope that the new administration might bring a bit of a sense of order back into the state and back into Zambian society, and help to sort of allow those institutions to reclaim some of that space that they haven't had for the last 6 or 7 years. So I think on that, I'll probably stop just so we can start with some of that conversation. But I do have some ideas about what a future UPND administration might look like, given that I wrote my PhD on it. But let's leave that for questions. So if anyone has a question, thanks.
Nicole, thank you very much indeed. There's going to be lots of questions. There's already a massive amount of questions and answers in the chat. And if you're not watching the chat, you'd be missing out. So please take a look at the chat. Now, we can't possibly field all of the questions that have been posed in the chat, but there is one bundle of questions that I think we should start off with, perhaps. And these are really the questions about the PF and Lungu. It's a whole bundle of questions. Was Lungu a liability to the party? Would the PF have done better without Lungu? Could it have, if the PF had found a way of running without Lungu, without a third term, could the PF have avoided splitting before the election? What is Lungu going to do now? What is the PF going to do now? And if the PF disintegrates, what will the new opposition look like? What kind of an opposition will there be in the coming few years? Who would like to try and answer that bundle of questions? Sishuwa.
Thank you. I thought Nic would speak to some of the questions posed. I'll maybe speak briefly to the question of whether Lungu was a liability to the PF. I think that he was. In many ways, the election was really a rejection of Lungu rather than a rejection of the PF. You know, the number of parliamentary seats that the PF has managed to retain across the country suggests that their main weakness really was the candidate. You know, the party was saddled with a deep and popular candidate. There was an understanding among many voters that Lungu was basically seeking a third term. And the expectation was that the Constitutional Court was going to stop him. But when that did not happen, I think many voters took it upon themselves to make sure that they had the final say on that. Zambians have never voted for a president more than 2 times. And he was the first president, for example, to seek another term after serving after being elected twice. But also, even within the PF, Lungu was a deeply unpopular candidate. And I don't think that if they had sorted out leadership question much earlier, they could have fared better. You know, he went into the 2015 election as the chosen candidate, so to say, by Michael Sata, given the position that he occupied. In 2016, I think he was tolerated within the party because there was an understanding that he would serve that term and then step aside for someone else. When he indicated willingness to continue, that really divided the party, especially given his poor performance also in other sectors.
Yeah, I agree with Sishuwa, if I should jump in there. I mean, I think there's a number of questions about what happens to the PF, and I think they're connected to a broader question, which is what happens now for Zambian democracy. So a couple of just quick thoughts on that. I mean, one thing is that, of course, Zambian parties don't tend to survive after they've been in power. They tend to be parasitic on the state and depend on the state for their resources. And it's also often power that is the glue that holds them together. So if you think about UNIP, I mean, okay, we could suggest that UNIP was perhaps a bit more durable than some of the others and was really killed in 1996 when, of course, Kasonde was stopped from contesting. But if we then were to look at MMD as well, MMD collapsed remarkably quickly after being in power for a long period of time and indeed being a dominant party. And in the last election, of course, both MMD and UNIP, polled extremely poorly. MMD, polling less than 1% of the vote just a few years after it was the ruling party. So if we were to look at the historical precedent, we would expect the PF to follow a roughly similar pattern. In other words, we would not expect PF to exist or exist as a meaningful political entity at the next election. Now, that might not happen this time around for one reason. And the one reason is that we don't see strong opposition parties other than the PF, right? The last time round, when of course MMD collapsed and PF took power, the UPND was there as an opposition party. So the PF becoming the ruling party, the UPND as an opposition party could hoover up the remnants of MMD, and those two parties benefited from the collapse of MMD, and the PF and UPND increased their vote share. This time round, we've only got the UPND and PF, so if the PF fragments, there'll be nothing else. And that might be an extra reason for people to try and keep the PF together. But of course, the critical problem for parties after they lose power is that the president usually goes, and then you need to replace the president, and that usually splits the party. The DPP in Malawi, where Peter Mutharika lost the last election, is facing exactly the same problem and has actually decided to postpone its own party conference for a couple of years because it doesn't know how to resolve that problem of who should become the leader next. And of course, we saw in the PF last time, the PF had to have a leadership contest, which of course Lungu won. It split the party down the middle, and we actually saw two separate processes, and it had to be resolved in court. So I suspect it's going to be an incredibly difficult time for the PF. And of course, I think that plays into a broader issue that many people are raising in the chat, which is on the one hand, people are thrilled that HH has won and there's been a transfer of power, but they're now worried that the structure allows HH to adopt or become the kind of president that Lungu was. We still have a weak judiciary. We still have a compromised constitutional court. We still have fragile democratic institutions. All of the legal issues, the Public Order Act, all the other things that Linda talked about are still there. And of course, Hichilema gave a really brilliant speech when he gave his acceptance speech after Lungu conceded and talked about needing to deal with many of these issues, which is fantastic. But I think a lot of people are a bit nervous that the structural constraints aren't really there to force him to do so. He doesn't face necessarily a very strong opposition in parliament. He doesn't face strong checks and balances democratically in terms of the key institutions. So I think that's one of the reasons why people are starting to say, ooh, would UPND have a 2/3 majority? Because they're worried that actually a 2/3 majority would confer too much power on the president. And I think there's a bit of a desire to see a more balanced political system that will help check the next government. I think that's in a sense in itself a sign of real democratic maturity. I remember being in Ghana in 2016, celebrating outside of the house of Nana Akufo-Addo, who had just won the presidential election, talking to MPP supporters. And I said to one of them, what will happen in 4 years' time if he doesn't deliver you the economic things you said? And they said, we'll vote him out, just like we voted the last one out. And that's the sort of thing that I heard, over the last few days in Lusaka. And I think that's exactly what you want to hear. You don't want blind obedience to the new leader. You want to be holding that new leader to account, because we've seen in so many countries, new leaders come in with so much optimism heaped on them and they haven't been able to deliver. Just think of President Samia in Tanzania, who many people welcomed as a breath of fresh air after President Magufuli, but has just arrested opposition leaders on charges of treason. So I think it's easy to understand why people are worried about that question of how much power Hichilema will have, and they're worried about that 2/3 issue, and they're very concerned about the future of the PF, not necessarily because they're PF supporters, but they recognize that a strong opposition is necessary for a functioning democracy.
If you're watching the chat, you'll have seen that there's a very interesting comment on this by Ruben Lefuka, making the point that, suggesting that the PF might be split between two centres of power, the bloc in parliament dominated by MPs from Luapula and Muchinga, the same group who wanted to succeed Lungu, and the PF Central Committee led by Lungu, who does not have the passion to rebuild an opposition party. I mean, when we might, this is me now, not Ruben, it does certainly seems implausible to imagine the PF's going to continue in the form it is. But there are certainly a lot of voters, particularly in Luapula, Northern Muchinga, who are not, it's difficult to imagine that they're going to feel that they are actually adequately represented by the UPND. So that there's a whole lot of voters whose loyalties are up for grab for a new reconstituted opposition party. Nicole, do you want to come in on this topic, or Linda, on the PF?
I think Linda might have better insights than me. I'm happy to cede the floor to Linda.
Linda?
Sorry, I was locked out at the time the question was asked, so I wasn't able to.
The future, what happens to Lungu, or what happens to the PF?
Okay, well, actually, we're as civil society, we're very concerned about a potential 2/3 majority. When Bill number 10, the Constitution Amendment Bill of 2019, was presented to Parliament, that was the real risk, that the incumbent would try and ensure that it would be difficult to unseat them in any future elections. So that threat is very real in this situation, because the new government may have a de facto 2/3 majority. If you factor in independents who favor ruling parties, and of course that means that they meet the threshold to pass any amendment to the Constitution, which is a very big risk. And unfortunately, it will. We don't want to rely on the ability of the incumbent to exercise restraint. There should be systems in place that ensure the rule of law and good governance, and that's why we talked about good institutions needing good people in the absence of to ensure checks and balances, given the fact that they have such a huge majority. Thanks.
Whilst you're with us, Linda, there was also a question which was really aimed at you about the Zicta case, and if I recall rightly, the question in chat was really asking, did you win the Zicta case on the merits, or did you win it because it was politically expedient for the courts to give you victory? To what extent was the case politically overdetermined? I mean, you hinted at that in your presentation.
Okay, so we haven't yet won the case. What we obtained was an ex parte order for leave, permission from the court to institute judicial review proceedings to challenge the decision of Zicta to do the internet shutdown. So as part of that ex parte order, they gave us a stay, which is a kind of injunction, stopping or reversing the the internet shutdown. But maybe just to say that our action was inspired by a case taken out in Zimbabwe following their last elections, in which there was an internet shutdown and the courts overruled the internet shutdown. And I think internet shutdowns affect everybody, including judicial officers. So they also don't want to see them. So I don't think it was so much a question of, it may have been influenced by the fact that there is a shift in power, but also the fact that it's such a basic need that everybody uses that it was always more likely to get a ruling in our favor.
And there's another question for you, Linda, or set of questions. And they're really about the kinds of reforms that would be needed to strengthen democratic institutions and prevent the kinds of abuses that you discussed in your talk. What kind of institutional reforms would you be hoping for? And are they politically viable? I mean, are they likely to attract support from the UPND or additional MPs if they require 2/3 majority?
I think I mentioned it right at the beginning of my talk that what Zambia has failed to do over successive governments is to reduce executive power. There's too much power vested in the Republican president. And in our constitution and in various other statutes, the executive, or the president specifically, is the appointee of, or the appointor of many constitutional office holders and other public institution holders. And we want to see that changed. That will require some constitutional amendment, to require reform of statutes. And we just hope that President-elect Hichilema makes good on his word that he wants to observe the rule of law, etc. And we hope he'll be willing to cede some of his power.
Great, thanks, Linda. The Nicole has put into chat that, if I can quote you, Nicole, we can hope for the best from the new administration, but must prepare for the worst. You want to say more about that, Nicole?
Sure. So I think it's worth thinking about, is a 2/3 majority potentially a good thing when we've seen so many stalled attempts at constitutional reform? Constitutional reform processes have been underway so many times in Zambia, and they have almost invariably and without exception been used politically by the administration to further certain, sometimes short-term aims, but certainly politically partisan aims. And so I think when we're thinking about whether or not a 2/3 majority is a good thing or a bad thing, as I said, I think we can hope for the best with this administration, that cool heads will prevail, that they have Zambia's best interests at heart, and that they will reform the constitution to remove lacunas, to bring legislation in line with contemporary standards of constitutionalism and law. But I think we also need to think about constraining power, as Linda was just saying, given that it's an executive presidency, it's a very strong executive presidency, and that a 2/3 majority in parliament would essentially make them unassailable. So I think you want to prepare for the worst excesses of power rather than hoping that they might be responsible in the deployment of that power.
Thanks, Nicole. We have somebody asked earlier about the youth vote. Certainly journalists have reported quite a lot about the youth vote, that very large numbers of young people at least turned out to vote. Nic.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I mean, I think it is clear that there was a great groundswell of desire for change amongst the youth, and there were a lot of younger people at polling stations. But I also think we perhaps need a bit of a kind of reality check on how much it was the youth that won it, which has gone around a lot of the journalists. I mean, one of the things that we were really worried about ahead of the elections, and Linda and Sishuwa could speak to this as well, was the fact that it wasn't just the voter registration process that was problematic, it was the distribution of national registration cards. And if you look at a lot of the civil society complaints, they actually had more complaints about the distribution of the cards than the election registration process itself. And that's really significant, because unless young people can get registration cards, national cards, they can't register to vote in the first place. And we know that there was a significant under-registration of new citizens in terms of giving out the cards in opposition areas, much more likely to be able to get them in ruling party areas. And that then shaped electoral registration. People without those cards couldn't get on the roll. So I think it would be quite surprising if this was an election that was really won and driven by younger people. My sense is that we had a pretty strong swing to the UPND from the PF amongst pretty much all age groups and amongst pretty much all areas of society. There were certain provinces that swung more and certain provinces that swung less. But overall, it was a pretty consistent swing. And so I would just caution a little bit about the idea that it was the youth that did it. I think it was Zambian society more generally that did it. But I'd be interested to know what Linda and Sishuwa think about that.
Sishuwa? Or Linda?
Can you remind me of the question?
It was about the role of the youth and the youth vote.
Well, it's difficult to assign any concrete importance to that constituency, because going to the election, Zambia should have had a census of population and housing in 2020. That would have given us an understanding of the number of young people, and we have to be very careful here. When we say youth, for example, do we mean people under the age of 35? Because that means different things in Zambia. It was important, of course, that young people took part in this election and came out to vote in large numbers, but we just don't have the actual figures to actually make an informed position about how crucial that constituency was in real terms, as Nic says. I do think I wanted to speak also briefly to the question of civil society, which I see keep popping up in the chat box. Civil society was important, not just in terms of encouraging or mobilizing people around the idea of regime change. They also actually mobilized themselves as monitors of this election, and that's one of the unacknowledged contributions, I think, of particularly civil society, because the number of international observers were very few. I think the European Union deployed about 32 observers long term. The Carter Center, I think, had 2, and maybe a few more. So it really felt like it was in Malawi on local civic actors to monitor elections. And this Christian monitoring group, CCMG, was very crucial to that. And they even had some kind of parallel voter tabulation that undermined perhaps the attempts to manipulate the election. Even when Lungu cried foul at the 11th hour that the election was not free and fair, because PF agents were chased from polling stations, civil society, who were in many polling stations across the country, said that was simply untrue. So I think that's another issue that we need to acknowledge civil society. The Hichilema presidency, I think, we have spoken about what might happen to the PF and what might happen to Hichilema's presidency given the numbers in parliament. I think the fears of a 2/3 majority are unfounded. I think they have about 81 seats so far confirmed out of 156 elected, direct elected seats. And then if you add the 8 nominations which the constitution allows the president to earn, that's about 89, which is almost the number that the PF had in the last parliament. So that is good for democracy, because it forces Hichilema to build alliances with the opposition and with the independent if he needs to make constitutional reform. And it's an important point that he made the reference to, I think, yesterday in his speech, that we need constitutional reform because the constitutional project remains incomplete, which means that if you want to abolish, say, a dangerous institution like the Constitutional Court, or reduce it to the level of the High Court so that it becomes a branch of the High Court, rather than putting it at the same status as the Supreme Court, for example, you have to reach out to the opposition to actually strike a compromise with them. But even in the event that there was 2/3 majority, for example, in Parliament for the UPND, the attitude of the government would really be set around what happens to, legislation like the Public Order Act, for example, the Cybersecurity Bill, which the UPND opposed when they were in opposition. They don't need two-thirds majority to abolish some of these laws. And if we can see a movement towards, repealing some of these provisions that they condemned when in opposition, then even the fears of a two-thirds may be unfounded, because it's also possible that they can use that really to strengthen constitutional democracy.
Thanks, Sishuwa. I think at this point, maybe we should do a quick bit of advertising that some of the questions about, for example, the youth vote are questions which we should be able to answer more emphatically in future. There is a panel study of voters in parts of Zambia, which is underway at the moment. And this is the Zambia election panel study, which is done by a consortium of researchers in Zambia and Sweden, the US, here in Cape Town and South Africa. And so we did 2 waves of that before the election, and there's a 3rd wave going to the field now. So we'll have a lot more information about Zambian voters from surveys than we've ever had before. Unfortunately, the first wave of the panel study data, which was collected in June, proved to be quite prescient about the election results, as was in a sense, the Afrobarometer survey conducted at the end of last year. There was, of course, a very notorious survey conducted supposedly in Zambia a while ago by the so-called Political Science Association, which predicted a massive Lungu victory. I wonder, has anybody heard anything from the so-called Political Science Association of Zambia as to why their so-called poll was so wrong? Has anybody heard anything from them, Nic?
I mean, not just them, Jeremy. There was an epidemic of opinion polls that all seem to have been out by about 30%. So I think, yes, sadly, the idea of sort of manipulating an election by pretending you're winning by issuing opinion polls that suggest you're on anything from 56 to 65% of the vote is become quite common, and was very common in Zambia. And yes, unfortunately, there's quite a few academics and others who now are left with egg on their faces, and I think reputations in tatters after playing that game. And I think this is one of the things that perhaps is really valuable about transfers of power like this, that if you sign up to a ruling party and you basically make lies, you lie to the people, you create fake data, you create fake opinion polls, and then you're revealed by a transfer of power, your reputation is undermined, and perhaps that will make people think a bit more carefully about doing so again in the future. So maybe one of the benefits of these kinds of transfers of power is keeping people honest in civil society and academia, as well as within the halls of power. And I think one of the things, perhaps as I guess we're sort of winding down now, it's worth saying is, I think the real benefit here for me is, less which party has come to power and more that we've had a transfer of power. And those transfers of power bring in different parties. They make people realize that you can change power through the ballot box. And one of the things that really struck me in the last few days in Lusaka, was the real belief of Zambians that you could change power through the ballot box. You didn't have to use violence. That although the election was unfair and unfair, it was still possible if enough people voted this would happen. And of course, that belief has now been reinforced by the election. And the fact that, Kaunda losing 91 helped to negotiate Rupaya Banda standing down for SATU in 2011, Rupaya Banda losing 2011, helped to negotiate Lungu standing down now. Maybe in the next election, we'll see Lungu and Banda negotiating Hichilema standing down for someone else. That is a really good pattern and a consolidation of democratic norms and values, and well beyond, anything in terms of HH. I think that process is one that really demonstrates the kind of value of transfers of powers in countries like Zambia. So that to me was the kind of residing thing that I will take away and has made me really excited and hopeful for the future.
Thanks, Nic. It's nice that you found something nice to say about Edgar Lungu. Final thoughts, Sishuwa, Linda, Nicole. Sishuwa.
I think that 2 or 3 points to conclude with. The first is, what we learn about selection is really Zambians have embraced democracy. There was active participation. When you look at the turnout, for example, averaging 70% across the provinces. It shows you an engaged, active citizen, and you need that in democracies for them to be consolidated. For example, despite being given 30 days, for example, within which to register as voters, millions turned up to register, and you could see the desire really to take part in the political process, to participate, right from the way the voter registration was conducted all the way up to the voting day. People turned up and were in queues by 2 a.m., for example. I have a nephew who struggles to wake up to go to school. You have to wake him up every day. When it came to voting, by 4 a.m. he was gone. When he was coming back, that's when I was waking up, and they were telling me that I voted for change. So it clearly shows you are engaged, and you need that in a democracy. And the second point, I think, is that this is a shot in the arm for African democrats, particularly across the region, especially following what happened in Malawi. Zimbabwe is having elections, I think, in 2023. South Africa has significant lessons to learn here from the Zambia situation. What is happening in Swatini, for example, we are seeing pro-democrats there. So Zambia, again, is becoming that leader, the model for democracy that it was in the early parts of the 1990s alongside Benin. And there are a number of lessons that we can learn from this example, including the fact that, even in instances where institutions are fairly weak, for example, it's actually possible to have a political change. The final point I wanted to say is that on Lungu, I think that in terms of conceding, actually, Lungu has started rehabilitating his legacy, because in Kaunda, when he left power, he was a deeply unpopular figure, but over time, he lived long enough to see his reputation improve. Whether Lungu lives long enough to do that remains to be seen, but that will really depend on whether or not A, he steps down from the leadership of the Patriotic Front, and two, what kind of activities he begins to engage in, for example, going forward. And it is also important to highlight the point that if Hichilema fails, that would really be the basis upon which the next opposition can rise. In Zambia, the opposition strength and significance is really dependent on the action of the incumbent. The failures of the incumbent is what create opposition. So in this sense, what we are seeing is smaller parties led by Karava and Fed members parties, for example, and UNIP. They are not really significant challenges. They don't really pose significant challenges to the Hichilema, presidency. But what happens within the UPND, how Hichilema manages to meet the expectations of so many people who voted for him amid a crippling debt situation, for example, would have a significant say in the quality of democracy, Zambian democracy going forward. If he appoints key members of civil society, for example, like Linda and others who are very crucial to holding Lungu and the government to account, then he's weakening alternative sources of power. And given the weaknesses of the media, the weakness of the opposition already, that may not spare well for the future of Zambian democracy. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Sishuwa. Nicole.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm now on my aircraft. So I wanted to go next in order to make sure I get my final 2 cents in. So I think the thing that came out for me from this election is the sophistication of Zambian voters. What is so often said is that Zambian voters will vote for someone who gives them money before an election, or that Zambian voters will vote along ethnic lines. And I think this election for me, and we'll need to do the data to prove this, but I think that this absolutely disproves all of those arguments and shows that Zambian voters are really sophisticated. And I'll end it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicole. Linda, some final thoughts.
I think what we've learned from the whole PF presidency is that democracy is always under threat, and people, civil society, individuals, the church, opposition parties need to be vigilant to maintain democracy in its truest sense. Of course, we're not alone. We saw that democracy was also under threat in the US, as was displayed under the Trump presidency. And I've been quoted as saying that, we were at a real inflection point, a tipping point in our democracy. We could quite easily have plunged into full-scale authoritarianism, but the people of Zambia stood up and were counted, and that is truly something that we need to be proud of. Another thing to look out for or maintain is an active civil society. We saw the role they played in ensuring that the government was held to account. And also, Zambians resoundingly rejected the divide and rule strategy that the government had employed. We saw them try to use tribal hate speech against the UPND, and it failed. So ultimately, that one Zambia, one nation narrative can continue. And lastly, it's nice to see that what has happened in Zambia has inspired several people in the region. I had several calls and messages from people from Zimbabwe, Uganda, Malawi, Eswatini. And it's nice to see that we can again take our place as a beacon of hope for democracy on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. That's great. I'm absolutely sure that the incoming government is going to have a honeymoon period when they're given an easy time by a lot of people. I'm sure that the international financial community is going to bend over backwards to actually be accommodating. So there's lots of good signs. But I'm sure that the new president, the new administration know that that civil society, people like Sishuwa and people like Linda, are going to give them a very hard time if they do any of the things that the previous government has done. And I have absolute confidence in Linda and in Sishuwa that they will make life as difficult as for the new government, if the new government turns out to deserve it, as the old government. I'd just like to say that we've had an absolutely great panel discussion. We've had more than 100 people participating, which is a real testimony to the four presenters. We've been very honored that the four of you have talked to us. It's been an incredibly vibrant chat. And I would just, on behalf of the entire audience, I'd like to say thank you very, very much indeed for talking today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.